Let me introduce our panelists this morning, and a distinguished group it is. Dr. Judith Stallman is Professor of Agricultural Economics and Rural Sociology, and also is a faculty member in the Truman School of Public Affairs at the University of Missouri. Dr. Stallman's research areas include state and local public finance, rural economic development, and fiscal and economic impact analysis. And she's currently working on issues of state and local government taxes and expenditures in Missouri and how Missouri compares with other states. Next to Judy is Jim Moody. Jim's no stranger to us here at MSBA. Jim's a governmental relations consultant based in Jefferson City, a former state budget director in the Ashcroft administration, and one of the true experts on state tax and budget policy here in Missouri. And Jim worked closely with us in the Coalition for Missouri's Future throughout this summer. Next to Jim is Brian Schmidt. Brian is the founder of Missouri Wonk, a policy analysis and consulting firm. He's an expert also on state tax policy and also was a great help to us in the Coalition for Missouri's Future this summer, the group of 40 organizations that opposed the veto override attempt. And I also might mention that MSBA has employed Brian as a consultant to provide research supporting our advocacy efforts. So we're looking forward to having Brian as a great resource for us in the future. And also with us today is State Representative David Wood of Versailles. Representative Wood was one of the 15 Republicans to vote against the veto override attempt. He's a great friend of public education, and we thank him for that. So we thank our panelists for being here today. And Judy, I think I'll start with you if we could, and to talk about some of the research that you've summarized regarding tax policy. And does the research you've summarized indicate that state tax cuts generally stimulate economic growth?
The big issue about tax cuts is if you cut taxes, the other side of the coin is cutting expenditures. And so if you look at tax cuts by themselves, the research shows that there is a small positive impact on economic growth for cutting taxes. But if you look at them in conjunction with the expenditure cuts that have to go with them, then what you see is that those expenditure cuts have a negative impact on state economic growth, and that together, if you put them together and look at the net impact becomes negative.
So, Judy, how is spending on education and other public services related to economic growth?
Part of the thing about public expenditures is public expenditures are really very important for the profitability of private firms, something that many people don't think about. So that the highways that the private firms send their trucks down are paid for by public expenditures, and if they have lots of potholes, those trucks have to go slower, they break their axles, those are expenses. So good quality public services have a lot of impacts on the profitability of the private sector. And something like education, where do the people we educate end up? Well, the vast majority of them end up working in the public sector. In the private sector, sorry. And so what we're doing is we are training, future workers is one of the things we're doing in education. In addition, when firms are looking like they want to expand, open a new plant, things like that, their managers are highly educated, often master's degrees, things like that. And one of the things they're interested in is where are their kids going to get a good education. And so having good quality primary education can attract people who are building jobs.
And so, Judy, there's so much focus on tax policy itself, but what are the other factors that lead to economic growth in a state?
Well, expenditure policy, of course. Not all expenditures necessarily are looked upon positively by the private sector, but some of those expenditures you're going to want anyway because you're not just serving the private sector, you're serving the citizens in general. But there are things that go on within states, some of which are within that have policy levers, some of which do not. So, for instance, energy costs within a state have an impact on the private sector. Worker productivity, which is in part of education, has an impact on the private sector. Just sometimes this gets a little more esoteric, but there's good research to back it up. People's attitudes about business, and particularly about entrepreneurship and innovation, if you have states or communities where people are willing to allow people to fail without stigmatizing them, you get a lot more innovation and entrepreneurship in those types of communities.
All right, let's talk for a moment about what happened this summer and the politics of all that and the defeat of the override attempt of House Bill 253. And I'd like to get some views on that. And Jim Moody, to what do you attribute our ability to prevent the veto override attempt?
Well, I think a tremendous amount of credit has to go to the 15 Republicans, including David, who voted against it. There were others in the General Assembly who knew it was a bad bill, but for one reason or another did not vote against it. Primarily Republicans. And I think we began to get the message out that this was a really bad bill. Unfortunately, I think we have given the proponents of tax cuts a roadmap to correct their errors in the course of doing that. And so this is, what we went through, which was, again, very difficult, I think, for our elected officials who were on our side, was simply an initial skirmish, I believe. And we're going to be back in January. I think our side, we continue to work with MSBA, the Civic Council of Greater Kansas City, my clients who help out here, George K. Baum Company. We are continuing to be vigilant, and we did not stop after September the 11th. And again, we met last week. We're going to meet in 2 more weeks. And I think we are going to come up with a plan. It is a difficult environment to work in. I can tell you that one of the problems we have, and Brian probably feels this too, is between the two of us, we know a fair amount because we tend to show up and testify against the bill. We get ignored. And it's frustrating for me because many of the problems with House Bill 253, I spoke about them in public legislative hearings and was simply ignored. But our voice, I think collectively we're getting stronger, and I think our voice will continue to be heard.
Representative Wood, you were right in the middle of all this. Can you talk about the pressures you faced and what the environment was like leading up to the veto session?
Sure. It was a lot of fun. Being a targeted district, I believe there were either 12 or 15 of us that received phone calls on a daily basis. In my office in the peak time, because with the coalition on this side and the Grow Missouri and the robocalls, I was fielding anywhere from 80 to 100 calls a day, emails consistently. To me, it came down to what was best for my district, best for the people I represent. I went through the numbers. By living this close, I live in Versailles, which is just the other side of the lake, so I'm in the capital 3 or 4 days a week. So I contacted Department of Revenue, I contacted Legislative Research, had them give interpretations of the bill and find out what was actually there. A lot of representatives don't have that luxury by not being that close or that available. It was a little bit of pressure, but when you know that you're doing the right thing, it's not hard to do.
Jim, what are the plans to react to probably what's going to come out of this as far as, and is tax credits part of that conversation, as far as being able to respond to and get out in front of it and be proactive?
This past year when Senator Dempsey did his opening speech in the Senate, he talked about a package that would include economic developments, tax cuts, and tax credits. And as the session progressed, what I call the pay-fors, tax credits, became disengaged from that. And I think history would show you that's typically what happens. The tax cuts tend to get more attention, and paying for them does not. We have a lot of, and it's what I was going to try and expand on what David was talking about. What we hear a lot is, well, Oklahoma and Kansas have cut taxes and they're continuing to grow. And that simply is not true, okay? And I can tell you with certainty that Oklahoma cut taxes in 2006, and their individual income receipts in 2014 are less than they were in 2007. So this idea that you can have it both ways, it pretty much does not work. And yet the rhetoric and the money continues to say that. And so the other thing you need to know is that the tax credits, even if you were to cut them, one of the larger ones is low-income housing, and it is a 10-year tax credit, okay? So if you were to start next year cutting it, you still have to pay for the credits that were issued this year 10 years from now. And to think that you can craft a large tax cut bill that is completely paid for by tax credits is probably unrealistic, because again, one of the larger tax credits is the so-called senior circuit breaker, which is it's about $115, $120 million a year, and it is not going to get cut, I don't believe, because it would impact seniors, and people don't want to do that. And so there's not enough critical mass, I don't believe, in tax credits to fund a large tax cut.
During the course of our discussion with our representatives, we repeatedly posed the question, what if the anticipated revenues are not generated? You know, the economy doesn't grow, and never received a response to that inquiry. My question is, what are the alternatives to tax cuts in regard to growing the economy in Missouri?
Let me try this, and then maybe we ought to have the economists talk about that. It's a tough deal. The economy that I grew up with, which was manufacturing based, pretty much no longer exists, or it doesn't exist as it did back then. And I see my friend Doug Whitehead here. We know that one of our large employers in Jefferson City, manufacturing based, is in the process of shutting down. I think it's about 450 to 500 jobs. And when you look at it realistically, you know, they're probably not going to be replaced. So the old economy has gone away. I'm not sure the new economy is here yet, but what I do know is from representing the Civic Council in Kansas City, which is the large businesses, which came out in opposition to House Bill 253, is the new economy is going to require an educated workforce. And that is the reason that the Civic Council was opposed to House Bill 253. And you can't create a better educated workforce by disinvesting in education. And the biggest problem, I've represented the Civic Council for about 15 years, and they have always focused, it is the largest businesses in Kansas City, they have always focused on a more educated workforce. I think that, you know, we need to be on a road to stressing post-secondary education and trying to fund it, because a lot of the new jobs, they're not the old manufacturing jobs. They require some skills. And I believe that you all had a presentation on Friday, I think, of school districts that are trying to link secondary education and associate's degrees, creating the types of jobs that businesses want, or the type of education that will allow people to participate in the jobs that businesses want. And so, I mean, you know, we need to have a plan that recognizes the changing environment out there. And the tax cut guys, that's not what they want. They want to limit government. If you look at the Kansas plan, Kansas is not going to grow. I can sit here and guarantee it. They are not going to grow because it is their plan not to grow government. And when you do that, you're going to impact education. Would you like to jump in?
With some trepidation. No, Education is critical. The other thing about education is it's a long-run investment. So we're not going to turn the state economy into the new economy next week. Education is a long-run investment. Many of the other things also are maybe not long-run, but medium-term, short-run. Do you have the financial infrastructure that is prepared to deal with all sorts of new firms? Or is your financial infrastructure, are your bankers much more comfortable making the types of loans they've always made? Now, that's not something necessarily that the state has any power over, but it's a private sector issue of how the private sector interacts with this new economy. Do you have the capital funding? Do you have the various types of capital in the state that are necessary to fund all sorts of new and innovative firms? Do you have the business services in the state to backstop these firms? They are going to need consulting engineers. They're going to need all types of process consultants, things like that. So, and as you see, many of those types of things are going to require specific education. In addition, there is a lot to be gained, as Jim said, by investing in education, associate's degrees, technical degrees, things like that.
During this summer, we had this question posed to us. Well, you all are against tax cuts, so what's your plan? So do we need a plan? Do we need to come up with an alternative to tax cuts or some principles that we could support from a political standpoint? Is that important for us to do?
As far as what's our plan, I think our plan is creating an environment that's conducive to business and growth, and I think that involves security, so making sure that our streets and highways are safe, and that we have enough money to fund prisons and incarceration, that we have infrastructure, which is the ability for businesses to be able to move their goods and for employees to be able to get to work in a timely manner. And infrastructure, I think, also includes technological infrastructure. So can businesses communicate through the internet? Do they all have access to that? And then I think the third thing is people and our investment in people, both in education, in preschool, K through 12, and higher education, and then also making sure that all of the people have access to health care.
May I say something? Let's just do a little thought experiment. Missouri is a low-tax state, has been a low-tax state since I started looking at the numbers about 1992. And what are we hearing that low taxes should get us? We should be getting us jobs and economic growth. And yet what we're worried about is we don't have jobs and economic growth. So that would suggest that if we are a low-tax state and we're not getting jobs and economic growth, either we're not investing those taxes in the right things, or perhaps we have nothing to gain by cutting taxes.